Crossing the river by feeling the stones. Just to tell you where we're going in the next half an hour, I'm going to talk about the issue of strategy. Then I'm going to talk about maps and why maps matter. After which, we're going to talk about patterns. And finally, depending on how much time I have left, we go on a magical mystery tour to talk about some random subject, which I'll tell you about later. So let's start with the issue of strategy and talk a little bit about who I am. I used to work for this company, for Tango, our online photo service. This is back in 2004. Relatively small, 10 million users, extremely profitable, rapidly growing, 16 different lines of business. All was good, except for one thing. And that thing was this person. This is the CEO. And unfortunately for us, our CEO was a fake CEO. They didn't actually know what they were doing, despite the fact we were profitable and our revenue was rapidly growing. Now, I know this because I was the CEO. The problem is, we had all the usual sorts of things like vision statements and all the rest of it, but rather than being the chess-playing master of strategy, I was more the alchemist, making up gut feel as I went along. So this is our strategy, or 2003, or part of it. Our strategy was customer focus. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. We'd adopted extreme programming. Anybody know what extreme programming is? No? None of you? Anybody heard of agile? Yes? Anybody being agile? Just a few of you. Right, so extreme programming is part of that sort of agile background. We'd adopted it in 2002, heavy users of open source technology, etc. But the problem with our strategy is I'd literally pinched it from another company and just changed a few words. It was hardly anything sort of dramatic. So I was worried that other people would rumble that I didn't know what I was talking about, despite the fact we were profitable and revenue was growing. So I used to go around conferences like this, but more on the business side, where I would record other CEOs talking about strategy, and I would record the key words. I called these business-level abstractions of a healthy strategy, or BLAs for short. So these are the common BLAs. This was 2014, actually. I've done this every few years. Digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem, open source, blah, blah, blah. If I did it today, what sort of words would I hear? Blockchain, yeah. You've got to have a bit of blockchain, yes. Oh, everybody's got to have a bit of artificial intelligence, yes. Anything else? Yes, I knew. No, that's obviously Joe. Joe in the background shouting serverless. So what I then did is I created a BLA template. Our strategy is BLA. We will lead a BLA effort of the market through our use of BLA and BLA to build a BLA. And then I combined the BLAs and the BLA template and auto-generated 64 random strategies. Things like this. Our strategy is customer focus. We will lead a disruptive effort of the market through our use of innovative social media and big data to build a collaborative cloud-based ecosystem. This is number 2. Our strategy is innovative digital business. We will lead a growth effort of the market through our use of customer focus. I can barely say the words. It's that painful. It's all random gibberish, but I sent them around. I got 400 responses back of 3 basic types. The first was, this is the exact wording from our business plan. The second was, I've seen 2 of these used already. And the third, and my favorite, is, are you for hire? So a friend of mine's put this all online. This is strategy as a service. If you ever need a strategy, just type in the URL at the bottom, and it will automatically generate you one based upon nothing whatsoever. If you want to pretend it's got AI and blockchain behind it, you can do, if it makes you feel comfortable. If you don't like it, it's really simple. You just press refresh and just keep on going until... And so that's the end of my talk. Thank you. No. So I started to suspect something was up, and I didn't know what was up. So back in 2004, 2005, I started to read into the subject. And I started with Sun Tzu. Anybody know what Sun Tzu wrote? The art of war. Right, super. So Sun Tzu talked about 5 factors that mattered in competition. First, understand your purpose, your moral imperative. Then understand the landscape you're competing in. Then understand the climactic patterns. So this is how your environment is changing, economic patterns. Then understand doctrine, so that's universally useful principles of organization. And finally, you get into the leadership bit, which is the bit where we do gameplay. And then I came across John Boyd. Anybody heard of John Boyd? No, US Air Force pilot. Came up with something called the OODA loop, heavily used in the military, also very popular with Donald Trump. So you have the game, that's your purpose. You observe the environment, that's what landscape and climactic patterns are about, understanding the environment and how it's changing. And then you orientate yourself around this with principles. Finally, you decide where you're going to attack, and then you act. And it's a cycle. And so you just keep on going around this. And I was quite excited by this. And I would show it to other people, and they would go, yeah, it doesn't matter. Strategy is all about the importance of why. But there's a problem with that statement, because there are 2 whys. There's the why of purpose, your moral imperative, I want to win the game of chess. And there is the why of movement, as in, should I move this piece or that piece? And those are fundamentally different things. So nonetheless, I had this strategy cycle. This is late 2004, early 2005, I decided to apply it to myself. So our company, our purpose, well, it was a bit of a mess because I was in charge. So we had 16 different lines of business. We needed to survive. Okay, well, it's a cycle. As I go around it, I can get better. So, we'll start with survive. So how do we understand our landscape? And that brings me to the subject of maps. So, Vikings, very frightening people. This is how Vikings used to navigate. From Herman, head due west towards Half, and you will have sailed north of Hatland. They used to use epic stories. So what would happen is you'd spend 10 years learning your epic story before you were put in charge of a boat. That is how we used to navigate. Now that story means that. So quick question, what would you use to navigate? A visual map or a verbal story? Map? Story? Well, if I'm giving people directions, to I don't know, the local fish and chip shop, I might go up the road, turn left, turn right, and give them a story. But if I'm trying to organize the troop movements of 30,000 people, I'm not going to try and do that with stories unless I want to kill people. Anybody here with a military background? Anyone? How important is our maps and situational awareness in the military? Very. Great. Super. So if it's something simple, I might use a story. A story, but anything complex, I'm going to use a map. What do we use in business? Stories. Okay, I'll give you another example. So this is the Battle of Thermopylae. So there are 117,000 Persians invading. Themistocles, the general in charge of the Greek armies, the Greek city-states, what he decided to do was to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians along the coastal road into Thermopylae. It's a narrow pass where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. And there were about 4,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans. Perfect. Now, I want you to imagine you're members of the Athenian city-state. It's the eve of battle. I'm Themistocles. I'm giving you purpose and moral imperative to defend against the invading Persian hordes. But then I say to you, I do not understand the landscape. I do not understand the environment. I do not have a map, but have no fear, for I have created a SWOT diagram. Strengths, a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses, the E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities, get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian, we actually hate the Spartans. And threats, the Persians get rid of us, and the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. Okay, so what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Position and movement on a map or some sort of magic framework like a SWOT diagram? A map? Right, what do you think we use in business? Magic framework. All right. So if I go back to alchemy versus chess, if I look at navigation, learning, and strategy, then chess is visual navigation, learning is context-specific, it's all about position and movement. It's what we call a high-level situational awareness environment. It's a bit like the military, which is why I asked the example before. If you ask a general, why did you bomb that hill? They're not going to tell you, oh, we bombed that hill because I read an article in General Weekly that bombing hills is the latest thing. They're not going to tell you we bombed that hill because I got some consultant report saying 67% of other generals are using AI, bombing hills. They're not going to say to you, well, I bombed that hill because that's what Uber would do. I mean, it's all about position and movement. Now, alchemy is all about storytelling, secrets of success, and magic frameworks. It's what we call a low-level situational awareness environment. And that's where we normally exist in business. And we love our secrets of success. My favorite article from Harvard Business Review from November 2011 is this one: How Earlobes Can Signify Leadership Potential. It is the phrenology of management. This is not an April Fool. This is a serious article about the importance of the size of your CEO's earlobes. We love this sort of outcome bias, authority bias, phrenology. It's all magic thinking. So that's where I was, and I knew I wanted to be over there. And I knew the difference between the environments was the existence or non-existence of some form of map. So what is a map? Well, that's a map. But it has certain characteristics which make it a map. One, you have an anchor, geographical north. Two, you have the position of pieces. This is north, south, east, or west of that. Three, you have consistency of movement. So if I want to go from Thebes to Thermopylae, which direction would I go? Okay? So if I started going northwest from Thebes and ended up in Athens, what would that tell me? The map is wrong or the compass is wrong, okay? So if I move a piece, it changes the context of the environment. And it does so because space has meaning in a map. So I thought, well, I've got lots of maps in business, loads of them. I have business process maps, I have mind maps, I have things like systems maps. Have you all seen a systems map before? Yeah? Right, so this is a systems map of one of our services. I've got CRM box here. I'm just going to highlight that box. I'm going to move that box. How has that changed the map? What do you think? Has it changed it? No? No? If I took a geographical map and I shifted, say, Australia and put it next to Bristol, would that change the map? Yes? The reason why it doesn't change the map is it's not a map. It's a diagram. Because in this diagram, space has no meaning. It's the same with business process maps, mind maps, all the rest of them. In fact, the one thing that those things we tend to call maps in business have in common is they're not maps. We keep using that word, and I'm afraid it doesn't mean what we think it means. So how to map? I took a systems diagram, and the first thing you have to do is give it an anchor. So I put the anchor at the top and use the customer. So we started off with who is the customer, what is their need? Online image manipulation, photo storage, website, etc. Now, those components themselves have needs. So what you can do is create a chain of needs. So online photo storage requires a website, requires platform, compute, data center, all the way down to power. So now what we've got is anchor and position. But that's not enough. We need movement. And I added movement by simply adding an evolution axis. Turns out there's a common pattern by which things evolve. Genesis, custom-built examples, products and rental services, commodity utility services. Now, it's not only physical activities, but it's data and practices that evolve as well. So now I have position, I have movement, I have evolution, I have a map, and so what? Well, the first thing is communication. So I'll give you an example of a tea shop. That's a map of a tea shop. It's a very basic map. We have the business has a need to sell cups of tea, and the public, we assume, have a need to consume cups of tea. And a cup of tea has needs. It needs tea. It needs a cup. It needs hot water. Now, the first thing with a map like this is we're making sure we're focusing on whatever the user need happens to be. But we can share it with others, and others will say, well, you're missing components, like we're missing staff. Who's going to make the cup of tea? So suddenly now others will come in and say, and start adding so-called strategy. Well, staff in the future will be robots. So we can start discussing amongst that group. Then finance people come along, because each of these nodes are actually stocks of capital. Each of the lines are flows of capital. So we can say, well, here's the revenue from a cup of tea. Here's the cost going in these different directions. That's the profitability coming back to us. And from that, we can add an income statement. So we now at least have the people building the system, the people understanding what the user needs are, the people talking about strategy, and the people talking about finance, actually communicating with each other. But you can go further, because somebody grumbly from operations will probably come along and say, why are we custom building kettles? Why aren't we using standard kettles? And then somebody from marketing will go, well, it's all about brand exclusivity. But the point is now, we can start looking at what that cost of using custom-built kettles are. And we're all talking about the same environment. So the first thing is communication. I'll give you an example of that, because digital transformation is a big thing today. This is one particular company and their digital transformation program. And it's all to do with weighing scales. So this group, their job is to report a count, a number, to a different department. And they do this by weighing stuff. So they have goods in, and basically things come into goods in, and they weigh it, and they record this number in a system, and at the end of the month they give a count. That's their job. Now, what are they counting is paper forms. Turns out it's quicker to weigh to work out the number of paper forms than it is to actually physically count them. And what they want to do is a digital transformation program. So they want to spend several million converting these old physical weighing machines into more digital electronic machines which are connected into their computer systems. And for them, that is digital transformation. Okay, so that was the map. So I went and talked to Goods In and said, where's this paper coming from? And they went, well, we've got distribution sites all over the country which send us this paper. So I went to a distribution site and said, where do you get your paper from? And they said, well, we print it out. Each one of them had printing facilities where they printed out large amounts of paper, and then they had delivery agents which they sent the paper to this goods in department where this other group measured or weighed the amount of paper that was printed out to work out the number of forms. So you go, where are you printing it out from? Well, we've got a CRM system. And where's that data coming from? Well, it comes from our users who fill our website online. So users were filling websites online into a CRM system. The paper was then printed out at multiple distribution sites across the country and sent physically to a goods in where somebody would weigh it to work out the count of the number of forms that were actually submitted. Okay? Now, they're all localized, maximizing their local area. They're trying to do their digital transformation program. The problem is no one's communicating. Because all of that, and all those capital flows, and all that investment, and it's huge amounts of money, could simply be replaced by select count staff from table. Okay? And does a digital transformation program make sense in that world? Not at all. All right, so now I want to talk about patterns. See, once you start to observe the landscape, you start to learn climactic patterns, so how the environment is changing. And there's about 30 of these, and we certainly don't have time to go through them all, so I'll just mention a couple. These are the rules that influence the game. So the first thing is you've got a map of the environment, and it's non-static. everything is evolving if there is supply and demand competition. So it doesn't matter whether it's compute or platform, it eventually becomes more commodity and utility-like. Now, the second thing that happens, or the second pattern you learn, is we have inertia to that change. It's created by past existing practice. So, I'll give an example, Netflix versus Blockbuster. Who was first with a website? Blockbuster, perfect. Who was first with video ordering online? Blockbuster, perfect. Who was first with experimenting with video streaming? Blockbuster, perfect. Who went bankrupt first? Okay? It wasn't the fact that Blockbuster lacked innovation. They out-innovated everybody. Their problem was pre-existing business and the inertia it created. Do you know what it was? The specific. It was late fees. Do you remember late fees? How you get a video cassette and forget to take it back and turn up the next day, etc., and they made their money. That was most of their business. So that's what created inertia to this changing environment. It wasn't, people say, oh, you don't want to be a dinosaur like Blockbuster. They out-innovated everyone. Their problem is they didn't manage their inertia. So the next pattern you learn is as things evolve, they enable higher order systems to appear, like electricity enabling computing. It's gone on throughout history. And the next pattern you learn is that as things evolve, their characteristics change. It doesn't matter whether it's money, computing, or penicillin. It starts over here in this uncharted, unpredictable space, which is where these new sources of worth are. And then over time, it becomes more industrialized, ordered, standard, stable, dull, and boring. Now, that was important for me. Because, as I said, we'd gone all agile in an organization in 2002, roughly. By 2004, we'd worked out it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because agile development, in-house development is very strong on the left-hand side, but it's pretty useless over in the industrialized space compared to something like Six Sigma and outsourcing. And both of them are fairly hopeless compared to something like lean in the middle. So lean in the middle, you're using, Scrum, MVP. Well, you've now got an MVP. So you're focused on learning and reducing waste. Agile, you're focused on reducing the cost of change because change is the norm there. And over here, you're now focused on reducing deviation. So to give you an example of this, high-speed rail. That's James Finley, CIO. They decided to build the whole of high-speed rail in a virtual world because it's cheaper to dig up a virtual world and say, whoops, we got that wrong, than it is to dig up the physical world. So this is the systems diagram for building the entire of HS2 in a virtual world. Now, their problem was, or James's problem, was do I outsource it all? Do I use off-the-shelf products everywhere? Do I use agile techniques to build it all? Or do I use a mix of all three? Now, the problem with the mix of all three is there's 387 million possible permutations in that simple diagram. So how do I work it out? So he had a cup of tea on a Sunday in his garden, drew a map. That's the map. It's now very simple. You outsource the stuff on the right-hand side. You build with off-the-shelf products in the middle. You build in-house agile techniques on the left. You use multiple methods at the same time. And of course, with a complex system, you already know that everything's evolving with supply and demand competition, so your patterns will change. So I'll give you an example of this. What is a world perception server? Right. Anybody from finance here? Anybody at all from finance? Nobody. Okay. So most IT is fairly elvish to people in finance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend you're all in IT. No, you're all in finance, and I'm in IT. And so what we're going to talk about is a self-driving car. And I'm going to use a systems diagram, which I've kindly translated into Elvish for you. So you have no idea what it actually means. And so now, because I want to collaborate and work with you, I'm going to ask you a question. Should we outsource or build our own? A, what do you think? Outsource? Yeah? Based on what? Because you're in finance. What about here? Should we outsource or build our own here? You haven't got a clue, have you? But I want to collaborate and work with you. I'm the IT. We want alignment and all the rest of it. Okay, so I'll give you the same diagram in a mapping format. Exactly the same diagram. Should we outsource or build our own A? Outsource. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Should we outsource or build our own B? What do you think? Build our own. Okay. I'll turn it back into English. There we are. Fortunately, we didn't try and build our own GPS system, though that's a touchy subject with Brexit at the moment. Obviously, we should want to build our own world perception server because there isn't any standardized formats. Now, the point about these patterns is you can use them to predict, to anticipate change. So back in 2004, 2005, we had our map of the landscape. I knew platform and compute would go to a utility. I knew we'd have inertia. I knew it would enable higher order systems. And once we had a map, we could talk about where to invest. Where should we attack? Do we want to differentiate on the photo service? Do we want to build the world's first platform as a service or infrastructure as a service? We knew others would play the game. Or do we want to wait and build something novel and new on top of it? So now we're having that why of movement. Where do we actually attack? And that works because we understand the landscape, we start to learn the climactic patterns, we can start to anticipate change. Then you get into doctrine. Now, these are universally useful principles regardless of context. And there's about 40 of those, which we won't go through, but I'll mention a few. The first is focus on user needs. Turns out that's universally useful. The second one is use appropriate methods. There's others, like how to remove bias and duplication as well. The majority of what we do in most organizations turns out to be waste, by the way. If you want to read more about that doctrine, there's a wonderful paper by GCHQ called Boiling Frogs, which talks about elements of doctrine within there. It's completely open source, so just search online for Boiling Frogs, help yourself. Now, once you do that, we start to get into the leadership bit, which is where we're talking about the why of movement. So these are the context-specific forms of gameplay. Now, there's about 100 of those. So you have your map, you can see where to invest. It now becomes a question of you learn patterns of how to manipulate the market. So open is a great way, for example, of driving things to a more industrialized state. You can slow it down with things like fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You can use constraints. There's all sorts of ways of manipulating the market. And then you act. So that's what we did for Tango. We had our map. We applied those basic patterns. We anticipated this change and looked at where we could invest. Then we came up with a form of gameplay. And our attack was building the first serverless environment. It was JavaScript front and back end, build entire application, single language, functional billing, billing to the function, and a whole play. It's a particular ecosystem play known as ILC, where you get everybody else to build on top of you, mine metadata, spot future patterns, and we had an open play around it as well. So that's what we launched. And we launched that in 2006, and it grew like hotcakes, and then Amazon launched, and it was all fantastic. Unfortunately, at that time, the parent company had a big US strategy consultancy firm come in and explain the 3 things that we were doing in terms of, remember this is 2006, in terms of serverless or what we called it, framework as a service back then. 3D printing was our other big area, and mobile phones as cameras were not the future. Those should all be shut down. In fact, the future was 3D television. So the parent company shut down cloud, 3D printing, and mobile phones as cameras and spent about $1 billion on 3D TV. Anybody here have a 3D TV? Anyone? Please. You have one, but you never use it. Well, you have no idea how much money went into making that. Anybody here use cloud? Anybody use a mobile phone as a camera? Anybody do 3D printing? Okay, so the lesson here, don't hire US strategy consultancy firms. But one of the things for us, or for me certainly, I learned from the map, because I had a map of the environment. I could go back and see how things had changed and learn new patterns in a way that I'd never done with business cases beforehand. Now, I sort of assumed everybody else in the world knew how to map and understood the importance of situational awareness in business, so I made it all Creative Commons over 13 years ago. It took me another 6 years to discover other people weren't mapping. So I went to a company called Canonical. They provide Ubuntu. Have you heard of Ubuntu? Yes? So I used to run cloud and strategy for Ubuntu. We used maps extensively between 2008 and 2010, which is when I was there, to work out how to attack the market. I spent $500,000, and it took me 18 months, and we went from basically 2-3% of the operating system market. We became 70% of all cloud computing by 2010. I mean, it was really simple. After that, I went back to research. Mark's a good friend of mine. I mean, they were in a dominant position. Then I wrote something called the Better for Less paper with a friend of mine, Liam Maxwell. This was for Francis Maud. This led to transformation of government in 2010, the creation of spend control, and assisted in the formation of something called GDS, Government Digital Services. So we use maps in government. This is Liam. They've used maps in this one particular service. They've saved $425 million, about $1.5 billion in its lifetime. We've saved several billion through this process. Maps are used in all sorts of different areas now, these forms of maps. As I said, it's all Creative Commons. A friend of mine's used it to write science fiction books, which are now being turned into Hollywood films. I have monks that map. I have a Russian Federation banking mapping, all sorts of interesting spaces. One of my favorite is the RNLI, who use maps to improve processes, and as a result of changes they've made, have saved a significant number of human lives. Most of my stuff, by the way, is nation-state competition. So I do lots of China versus USA, looking at entire industries. I mean, most of my work is at policy level. I don't spend a great deal of time with the engineering side anymore. This is the automotive industry and the games being played by China. So quick summary, I talked about strategy and the importance of, there is a strategy cycle. For most, it's all random gut feel. To really get to grips with it, you need to understand the landscape. You need to be able to observe the environment. That's why maps matter. As a result of using maps, you will learn patterns. Some of those are climactic, useful for anticipation of change. Some of those are doctrine, so universally useful, good for organization. And some of those are gameplay. It's key to start with that cycle. It's really important to observe the landscape before you act. And of course, it's an iterative process. So the more you do this, the better you get. Now, this entire presentation can be summarized with the phrase, crossing the river by feeling the stones. Famous economist Deng Xiaoping, where he's talking about having purpose and direction, understanding the landscape as you go, and adapting, taking small steps in order to find your way. And so at that point, I would just mention all of this stuff, as I said, is Creative Commons. There's a 600-page book. You can just help yourself, which will teach you about how to map, how to understand the environment, where to attack spaces, and all those different forms of patterns. And I'll just say thank you.